As we have said, for most of human history, almost everyone lived on less than $3 per day, plus or minus $1 or two, which we refer to as the subsistence level of consumption. And while the Industrial Revolution set off an explosion of economic growth that has lifted the typical person in those economies out of poverty, not all countries in the world have succeeded in industrializing. As the world entered the 21st century just a couple of decades ago, nearly 2/3 of the global population was still living at this subsistence level. Since the 1970s or so, there have thankfully been significant reductions in the share of the global population living in extreme poverty at less than $2 per day. In 1981, over 40% of people lived in those awful conditions, where starvation is a continual threat. But by 2017, that had fallen to less than 10% of the global population. And since the year 2000, progress is finally being made again on lifting people out of poverty altogether. And around 2012, for the first time in human history, more than half of the Earth's population had risen above subsistence living. Average income differs greatly between countries of the world. In Ireland, Singapore, and Luxembourg, GDP per capita, adjusting for purchasing power parity, was over $90,000 per year in 2020. The United States had a GDP per capita of $63,500. Formerly impoverished nations like China and Thailand had pushed their GDP per capita to over $15,000. And yet, there remain many countries with average incomes below $2,300 per year, like Uganda, Afghanistan, Madagascar, and Burundi. The end of poverty is starting to appear over the horizon. But you have to wonder why, more than 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, the problem persists. Consider what the Solo model would predict. All of the ideas and technology are out there. Other countries should be able to adopt those ideas and catch up. And in fact, that is exactly what other countries did once Britain stumbled upon the formula for economic growth. France, Germany, the United States, Australia, Japan, and more just copied the progress and continued to learn from each other. Over time, there should be a convergence as countries get the physical and human capital they need to be rich. But that isn't really what happened. Instead, there has been a great divergence over time, where once there was little difference in the average incomes of different nations, everyone was at the subsistence level. After 1800, some lifted off while others stayed poor. But again, why? Industrialization brings with it untold riches, which are shared widely, lifting whole populations out of poverty. Why would some nations not embrace this? It's time to bring together our understanding of economic growth under a more general theory. The Solo model describes what we would call the proximate causes of prosperity. Capital, human capital, and ideas are what spur on economic growth. But the Solo model can only work if these ingredients are planted in the soil of the fundamental causes of prosperity, which include geographic conditions, cultural attributes, and good institutions. Only when these fundamental causes are aligned with economic growth can the proximate causes begin to fuel that economic growth.